Welcome. Although Bethlehem was the childhood home of King David, its name does not appear anywhere in the book of Psalms. However, Bethlehem had another name, an old name, Ephrata, and that appears in a psalm which we're looking at today, Psalm 132. My name is Keith Simons. I'm a Bible teacher from England, and I present these talks on how you can understand the King James Bible using the book of Psalms. Each time we look at a different psalm, verse by verse and word by word, and today's psalm is Psalm 132, one of the 15 psalms that are headed A Song of Degrees. Degrees mean upward steps, such as the steps that the pilgrims would climb when they went to God's house, the temple in Jerusalem. But it was not David who built the temple. It was Solomon, David's son. David very much wanted to build it. The account of that is in 2 Samuel chapters 6 and 7. David wanted to build it, but it wasn't God's work for him to build. Yet David was passionate about this. He wanted so much for the centre of Jerusalem, the centre of Israel, to be the place where God's house should be, the place where God would be present permanently among his people. And so when he desired to build a house for God, God sent him a message back, and God said that he would build a house for David. He would establish David's royal family as the family that would rule Israel, and from which God's King, the Messiah, would in the course of time come. So Psalm 132 verse 1 begins with a prayer. Lord, remember David and all his afflictions. I suppose there was great trouble for David's family when the author wrote this psalm. And that's why, in prayer, it's necessary to remember the promises of God to that family, to remember the relationship that David had with God, and to remember David's afflictions. Afflictions means troubles, struggles. The Hebrew word could mean humiliations. David became a powerful and wealthy king, but he humbled himself. He wouldn't accept that wealth and that success for himself because he cared so much about establishing God's place in Israel. Remember verse 2, how he sware unto the Lord and vowed unto the mighty God of Jacob. To vow means to make a promise. To swear is even more serious than that. It means to make a promise, an oath to God, a serious promise to God about something you're going to do. And David made his promise in the name or to the name of the mighty one of Jacob. The word God that appears in our King James Bible, the mighty God of Jacob, has been supplied by the translators. Yes, David made his vow, his promise, by God's mighty strength. He declared that Jacob was the ancestor of the Jewish people, and that the God who Jacob chose was his God too. And so to this God he made his promise. Now, what was David's promise then? It's a little difficult to follow. It's in verses 3 to 5 because it's not quite to be understood literally. Let me read you verses 3 to the beginning of verse 5, and you'll see what I mean. Surely I will not come into the tabernacle of my house, nor go up into my bed. I will not give sleep to mine eyes or slumber to mine eyelids until I find out a place for the Lord. Okay, so what's David's promise? His promise is to find out a place for the Lord, to find the place where God's house, the temple, should be built. And until David does this, he's not going to do the things in verses 3 and 4. Not come into the tabernacle, that means the tent of my house. Overall, the meaning is he's not going to come into his luxurious palace, nor is he going to go into his luxurious bed and fall asleep until he finds that place for the Lord, until he's chosen the place for the temple. Okay, this sounds like a simple promise then. If he's not going back home to his palace and he's not going to go to his bed to sleep until he's done that, what does that mean literally? It means he's going to do it that same day. That's not a difficult task for a powerful and wealthy king. The same day to choose a place where he's going to build a temple. Why all this seriousness? Why all this emphasis? Why is this described as David's afflictions in verse 1? Because this promise is not to be understood as a literal promise that he's going to do this the same day, but rather in a more figurative meaning. What is David promising when he says he won't go into his palace? He means he won't enjoy the wealth of his palace. He won't enjoy the luxury that a king has. What does he mean when he says he won't allow his eyes to sleep, to close in sleep, in other words? He means that he won't allow himself to feel at rest, at ease. He's chosen the way of humility, of affliction, rather than the way that most kings would choose to live in luxury. He doesn't want luxury because there's something more important to him. Verse 5, until I find out a place for the Lord, an habitation for the mighty God of Jacob. A habitation is the place where someone lives. He wants the God who Jacob knew to be the place, to be the God who Israel's people know. And he wants that to be possible because in his capital city, Jerusalem, he wants there to be a place for God. He wants God to have his habitation or his home there. Verse 6 is a change of emphasis. Lo, we heard of it at Ephrata. We found it in the fields of the wood. We're not told at this stage what the it is. We're going to discover that in verse 6. It's the Ark of the Covenant, the evidence of God's relationship with Israel. So what does David mean in verse 6? He probably means that he heard about the ark when he lived as a boy at Ephrata, also called Bethlehem. He heard about how God had given directions for the building of this sacred box, the box that contained the tablets of stone on which the 10 Commandments were written, the physical evidence of God's relationship with Israel's people. But he couldn't visit it as a boy. He only heard reports of it, rumours of it. People didn't know where that box was. It was as if God's relationship with Israel's people had been lost. How did that come about? You can read the story of it in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel. But the ark basically was lost by Israel's people in war and then sent back to Israel, where it ended up at a place called Kiriath Jearim. That's 1 Samuel 6:21 2:7 and verse 2. Kiriath Jearim. That name is probably hidden when David says, "We found it in the fields of the wood." Wood is jar, like Jearim in Hebrew, or in the form that we write it in the King James Bible. The fields of the wood, in Kiriath Jearim, in this remote place, in this most unlikely place, David found the Ark of the Covenant. And he decided that he would bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem so that the temple could be built at Jerusalem. What enthusiasm there was to this idea. Enthusiasm which David got wrong originally, as we read in 2 Samuel chapter 6. But then correctly, he brought it to Jerusalem in the way that pleased God. David's desire, Israel's people's desire, was verse 7. We will go into his tabernacles. Tabernacles, as we've said, means tents. David built a tent for the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem until the temple could be built. We will worship at his footstool. Compared to heaven, which is called God's throne, a place on earth where God is present, is like God's footstool, the place where God rests his feet. You might like to turn to Isaiah 66 and verse 1 for a verse that describes heaven as God's throne and the earth as his footstool. Yes, David wanted God to rest and remain in Jerusalem. And so the prayer in Psalm 132 verse 8, Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy strength. That's like the words that Moses used when Israel's people were travelling through the desert with the Ark of the Covenant. Let me read you Numbers chapter 10 and verses 33 to 35. And they departed from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey, and the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord went before them in the 3 days' journey, to search out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was upon them by day, when they went out of the camp. And it came to pass, when the ark set forward, that Moses said, Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. Moses said, Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered. And David, or the author of Psalm 132, writes in verse 8, Arise, O Lord, arise, not to continue your journey to go from one place to another, but arise, O Lord, into thy rest. David chose not to rest. He wanted God to rest and to remain in Jerusalem. Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy strength. Yes, just as the Ark of the Covenant went forward into Jerusalem, so God was choosing that city to be his place, his strong place. And the prayer continues in verse 9 of our psalm. Let thy priests be clothed with righteousness, and let thy saints shout for joy. The priests clothed with righteousness. Righteousness is a right relationship with God. If you're clothed with something, like if you wear a long robe, then other people can see it too. Oh, let the priests be righteous. Let them have a right relationship with you. Let them not be corrupt or wicked or stained with evil. And let them be clothed with it. Let all God's people see that the priests have a right relationship with you, O God, so that your saints, God's people, all of God's people can shout for joy and know the joy that God has to be living among his people in Jerusalem. Verse 10, for thy servant David's sake, turn not away the face of thine anointed, God's King. It can mean the Messiah, but here it seems to mean David himself. It's saying, God, because of your promises to David, don't turn away from him now. Support him and strengthen him, that he may serve you in truth and in the right way. Now, I've spoken about 2 Samuel chapter 7 and how when David wanted to build a house for God, God turned around, as it were, and said, no, my house will be built, but for now, I'm going to build a house for you, David. God wanted to build a house for David. And the second half of that psalm is all about how God would build a house for David, how he would establish a place of David's royal family in Jerusalem. So Psalm 132, verse 11, the Lord hath sworn in truth unto David, he will not turn from it. So just as David swore his oath, in other words, he made a serious promise to God in verse 2, now the Lord swears an oath, makes a serious promise for David's benefit in verse 11. What is this promise that God himself is making? Of the fruit of thy body will I set upon thy throne. The fruit of thy body, a figurative way of describing the children that come to David's family. And one of those children, his son Solomon, was indeed set on David's throne and became king after David. And God was establishing that relationship, not just with Solomon, but he wanted it to be with David's family for a long, long time, forevermore afterwards. Verse 12, if thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony means witnesses, it refers to God's law, that I shall teach them, their children shall also sit upon thy throne forevermore. So God is saying that it's important that David's children, from Solomon onwards, and his grandchild and his great-grandchild after him, should keep God's covenant, should stay true to the relationship that God has with his people Israel, should obey God's law. And if that happens, then David's throne will become Solomon's throne, and the throne of Solomon's family after him. God wanted them to rule permanently in Jerusalem, to have their royal place there. Now, in reality, they didn't. Even Solomon turned away from God, built places for the worship of false gods, and David's family remained kings over Israel for, I think it's about 400 years. And during those 400 years, some of them were loyal to God, but many of them were not. And so that dynasty, that succession of kings that began with David, did come to an end. But God still wanted David's family to rule, and the Messiah, the Christ, is a king from David's family. But why did God want David's family to rule Jerusalem? Verse 13, for the Lord hath chosen Zion, he hath desired it for his habitation. Zion is a poetic name for Jerusalem. It's especially the name that is used of the hill on Jerusalem where the temple, God's house, stood. Why did God choose Zion? Because he desired it for his habitation. A habitation means a place where you live. God desired to live in Zion. David was right then. David was right to want Jerusalem to be that place where God has his permanent home. But it was for God to establish it. It was for God to choose that place. And if God is going to dwell in that place, if God is going to be the real King of Jerusalem, then what follows becomes true. This is the promise now. This is a promise that will only be fully true in the time when Messiah rules, God's King from David's family, ruling in Jerusalem and ruling the whole world. Then God will truly be living in Jerusalem and present with his people there. Verse 14, God declares of Zion, "This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it." Yes, David wouldn't accept rest in Jerusalem because he wanted, verse 8, God to rest in Jerusalem. And now, in verse 14, God declares that he has accepted it. This is the place where God has chosen to rest and rest forever, to rest and remain, to dwell, the place that he truly desires. Verse 15, "I will abundantly bless her provision." Provision means the food supply. God is going to provide all the food that the people need. And God cares. God cares about every one of his people. And so he declares at the end of verse 15, "I will satisfy her poor with bread." They're not going to be short of food. Bread was very much a staple food in Israel. God is going to satisfy the poorest people with a generous supply of the food that they need. Now, in verse 9, the author prayed to God, "Let thy priests be clothed with righteousness, and let thy saints shout for joy." And the answer to that prayer, a literal answer, comes in verse 16, when God says, "I will also clothe her priests with salvation," with safety, with success that comes from a right relationship with God, and it's to be their clothing, so that all people can see that those who lead the people in their prayer and their worship of God are doing it from a right relationship with God. So no wonder God's saints, his holy people, all his people, join in a shout of joy. And verse 17, "There will I make the horn of David to bud." Horn is obviously the bony point that comes on the head of an animal. It's used, though, of kings in the Bible as a word picture for their strength. "There I will make the strength of David to bud." Another word picture, a picture of a plant which throws forth shoots from its root. And the Bible often speaks of the Messiah as a righteous branch, a branch coming from David's family, like an old tree that sends forth a new, young and strong branch. And that is how kingship has to continue through the generations. You might have a strong king, but it has to be a new king who takes his place to rule after him. But for examples of how the Messiah is described in that way, you can turn to Isaiah 11:1 or Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5. The branch coming from David's family and taking David's place. And then verse 17 of our psalm ends with the words, I have ordained a lamp for mine anointed. Mine anointed, my Messiah or my King. If God has ordained, if God has appointed or prepared a lamp for his anointed, for his King, for his Messiah, then that means that lamp will always be burning, and that place will always be there in Jerusalem for God's King, the King from the family of David. Verse 18, his enemies, David's enemies, or the Messiah's enemies, will I clothe with shame. Once more, this word picture of clothing, what people see of you. And these enemies who wanted to defeat God's King are clothed with shame. Everyone can see they're ashamed. They're ashamed because they chose an evil plan. They chose a plan of rebellion against God's King. And that plan has been utterly defeated, not by David, but by God, who declares his enemies will I clothe with shame. But upon himself, upon David, upon God's King, shall his crown flourish. Of course, the crown signifies a king's royal authority. That word flourish has two meanings in Hebrew. It can talk about a light shining, can mean that the crown shines just as a beautiful gold crown or a crown with jewels shines in the light. Or it can mean to blossom, like a tree which suddenly turns into beautiful blossom with the flowers coming out. And maybe the King James translators chose the word flourish to express both of these ideas. The success of God's King ruling over God's people. Please write to me. My email address is 333kjv@gmail.com. My name again is Keith Simons. I'd like to know where in the world you are, or if you're in the United States, in which of the states. Now in conclusion, let me read you the email address again, 333kjv@gmail.com. And now, here's the whole of Psalm 132. A Song of Degrees. Lord, remember David and all his afflictions, how he sware unto the Lord, and vowed unto the mighty God of Jacob. Surely I will not come into the tabernacle of my house, nor go up into my bed. I will not give sleep to mine eyes, or slumber to mine eyelids, until I find out a place for the Lord, an habitation for the mighty God of Jacob. Lo, we heard of it at Ephrata. We found it in the fields of the wood. We will go into his tabernacles. We will worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy strength. Let thy priests be clothed with righteousness, and let thy saints shout for joy. For thy servant David's sake, turn not away the face of thine anointed. The Lord hath sworn in truth unto David, he will not turn from it. Of the fruit of thy body will I set upon thy throne. If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony that I shall teach them, their children shall also sit upon thy throne forevermore. For the Lord hath chosen Zion, he hath desired it for his habitation. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provision. I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout aloud for joy. There will I make the horn of David to bud. I have ordained a lamp for mine anointed. His enemies will I clothe with shame, but upon himself shall his crown flourish.